Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome everyone to my humble abode in Putrajaya. Together tonight we have with us our distinguished guest, Professor Nader Hashemi, who is a director at Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University in Washington. Professor Nader Hashemi is not someone who is basically estranged to us because we have invited him before over here. In fact, we have, can you take your book over there? Yeah. In fact, we have translated his book, yeah, this into a title, Islam, Secularism and Democracy Liberal, from the book Islam, Secularism and Liberal Democracy, right? And I think this is a very important book because to me, it changed the way that I think about secularism itself. Many of our detractors, when they talk about secularism, they think that, there's a rise of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk II.
Right.
You get what I'm saying? So, but we are not basically proposing separation of state from religion.
Yeah.
At all. We are not.
Right.
We are more proposing the idea of what Professor Nader Hashemi wrote in his book, from the idea of Alfred Stefan about the idea of twin toleration. Right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That's the idea of what we need in a democratic country, where the idea of twin toleration is that the state, the citizens, the religious citizens in the country tolerate the state to basically legislate laws, even though laws pertaining moralities.
Right.
So they have to. They cannot say that inil hukmu illa lillah. They cannot say that only God can legislate laws.
Yeah.
That's wrong. That's going to turn into theocracy.
Yeah.
Right. So in order for democracy to be established, is that we have to need twin toleration. One is that of the citizen, and the other one on the part of the state. On the part of the state is that the state should be open for the citizens to express their religious identities, right? Not like in Turkey or in French, right? Where you can't even wear a headscarf or something like that. So that's the idea of the whole idea of twin toleration, in order to negotiate a successful democratic state.
Yeah.
And this has been experimented in Tunisia by Rashid Ghannouchi.
Right.
Yeah. Of course, he's currently in
jail.
prison.
Yeah.
Right. But we'll talk about that later on.
Yeah.
But the thing is that it has been experimented before. So the whole idea, is very important for us to understand, because this is what IRF is proposing. Right. Understanding this means that you understand the idea of IRF.
Yeah.
If you still have the idea that IRF is promoting secularism, trying to annihilate religion from the public sphere, I mean, that's wrong. That's not what IRF is all about.
Yeah.
So, this particular book is very, very important.
Yeah.
Right? So, without further ado, because tonight we're going to talk about another hot topic about Zohran Mamdani, the newly elected mayor of New York City. You see, in my experience, I've never been interested in American politics so much, except first during when the Obama he was trying to get his first presidency, right? During that time, I was so excited about it.
Yeah.
And the second time was this time.
Yeah.
So only twice,
Yeah.
right? So, and we have so much hope for Zohran Mamdani.
Yeah.
And I think that we have here a person who is more able to elaborate more on this particular issue.
Yeah.
And with that, without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Nader Hashemi.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Selamat petang. Apa khabar? Thank you, Farouk, for bringing me back to Malaysia. This is my fourth visit to Malaysia. The first 3 times Farouk brought me here. And it's wonderful to be in Malaysia, in part because it takes me outside of Donald Trump's America, where, as you hinted just a moment ago, it's a very dark and depressing time. But there's a very famous expression that some of you might know, that it's always darkest before the dawn. This is the hope that keeps us carrying on. And I was reminded of that statement when Zohran Mamdani started to get popular. And the fact that he won in the race in New York is the one source of, hope, optimism, and encouragement, that at least I have felt since Donald Trump, became president. There's sort of like this, there's a reason now to get up in the morning and to be optimistic. I have, now that he's been elected, I have my concerns that what's going to happen when he becomes mayor, because he has a lot of enemies. I'm going to talk about that. But at least for now, I think there's some reason to be optimistic. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about the election in New York. I want to talk about how did this guy by the name of Zohran Mamdani manage to become mayor of New York when he ran on a campaign platform where he identified himself as a democratic socialist in the capital city of capitalism. And he also identified himself as an immigrant and a Muslim in a country that has the largest Jewish population in the world, and at a moment when there's a lot of antagonism and anger toward immigrants. How did he do this? And how did he manage to defeat a candidate who had massive name recognition? Because his opponent was the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo. And Mario Cuomo comes from a very big family in New York, because Mario Cuomo's father was the former governor of New York. And Cuomo has a famous brother called Chris Cuomo, who was on television all the time. So everybody knew who the Cuomos were. But, 1 year ago, if you were to go to New York City and ask people, what do you think of Zohran Mamdani? Who are you talking about, right? So this is actually somewhat of a stunning victory. And the question is, to what extent does Mamdani's victory in New York represent the future of American politics? And critically, because we're in Malaysia, we're in the Muslim world, how did his Muslim background shape his campaign and his electoral victory? And finally, as the title of the presentation tonight, as was advertised, I want to, suggest some basic ideas on what can Malaysians learn from Mamdani's victory. And this is always difficult to do because, the United States and New York are very different than Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur. But I still think there are things that we can learn, and I'll leave it to you, who know Malaysia better than I do, to sort of talk about to what extent this man called Zohran Mamdani, the campaign that he ran, the vision, the ideas, the way that he became mayor, to what extent this applies to Malaysia or not. That's something that we can talk about. So I want to begin with a brief, I want to talk briefly about his biography, because I don't know if everyone knows the details of his background. I want to talk about and answer the question, how did he manage to win? And then the last part is, I want to talk about the lessons for Malaysia politics, with a special emphasis on what I call the Islamic ethics of Zohran Mamdani. Because this is something that has received very little serious attention. We know that he comes from a Muslim background. There's different scattered stories about Mamdani's Islamic identity. But I'm of the view, having sort of looked at the campaign very closely and read everything that I could on Zohran Mamdani, there is a fundamental Islamic core that drives him, that shapes him, and that informs his political agenda. Now, to talk about this in the United States is very difficult, because he's all these enemies who are saying, oh my God, we have a Muslim mayor in New York. What does this mean? Does this mean that, Sharia law is coming, and that, Al Qaeda is going to be coming. So when I have to be very careful what I say in the United States about his Islamic ethics. But since we are in friendly Muslim territory here, I'm hoping that we can have an honest conversation about the Islamic ethics of Zohran Mamdani. So let me just begin with some general points about the election in New York and Mamdani's victory. Now, when we were organizing this event, I asked people to watch the Al Jazeera documentary called Mamdani versus the Machine. I'm just wondering how many people managed to watch that documentary. Okay, so for those people who watched it and those people who didn't watch it, the reason why the documentary is called Zohran Mamdani versus the Machine, because the machine that is referenced in the documentary is the machine of political power in the city of New York that Zohran Mamdani managed to defeat. And so I believe that Mamdani's victory as mayor is the equivalent of a political revolution in the United States. If you listen to how much of the mainstream media and the Democratic Party interpreted his victory, they said, look, this is just a wonderful victory for the Democratic Party and a bad night for Donald Trump. Because that same night where he got elected, they had elections for the governor of New Jersey, the governor of Virginia, and all of those races, Democratic candidates won. And so the mainstream interpretation was, look, so the Democratic Party is coming back to power. But Mamdani's election is different than the other races that were taking place that evening. It's the equivalent of a political revolution for the following reasons. Mamdani had to go against and to challenge a very powerful group of individuals and organizations in their own backyard, and he managed to defeat them, despite the fact that he had very little economic and political power, and they had all of the political power and money. He ran on a campaign, as I said a moment ago, as a democratic socialist in the city that is known around the world as the capital city of capitalism, where you had all of these major pro-Israel organizations that are based there, and a large Jewish population that became very much part of the campaign. I'll say something about that in a moment. Zohran Mamdani, in my view, his victory suggests that he has in many ways redrawn the rules of American politics and offered a new playbook on how to obtain political power in the United States. The old playbook, if you wanted to get elected to high office in the United States, Congress, Senate, the president, or mayor of a major city, the way that you would get elected is you had to have a lot of money and a lot of friends in powerful places. And you had to be very close to special interest groups. You needed their support, you needed their connections, you needed their backing to get elected. Mamdani has come along, and he has taught us that there's a new way of playing the game of politics in the United States where you can win a political victory by out-organizing your opponent and overcoming the other side's advantage in terms of monetary resources and political connections. This is I think, one of the big lessons that we learn. What's so interesting, if you look at his campaign, and so fascinating, and the documentary that I mentioned goes into this, is that he had many opponents, including opponents within his own party. So the leadership of the Democratic Party did not back Zohran Mamdani. They either were silent or they backed his opponent. His opponents used every dirty trick in the book: scare tactics, fear-mongering, outright lies, the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and the unleashing of a tidal wave of anti-Muslim bigotry that I hadn't seen in the United States in a very long time. And despite all of those tactics, they were unable to stop him. They played a dirty game of politics, and thankfully they lost. According to one study, 80% of the social media tweets during the election campaign were explicitly anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. the New York Times editorial board officially took a position against Mamdani. The Washington Post editorial board, which is even nastier than the New York Times, had a vicious editorial attacking Mamdani. The top leaders in Congress were against him. The 2 senators from the state of New York, who were Democrats, were against him. The President of the United States repeatedly was attacking him. The entire business elite in the country were against Zohran Mamdani, and they spent huge sums of money to try and defeat him. Consider the following amounts that were used to defeat Zohran Mamdani. $8 million from Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York and one of the richest men in the United States. $3 million from the co-founder of Airbnb. $3 million from the Estee Lauder family. $2 million from Bill Ackman, a prominent pro-Israel businessman who appears in the Al Jazeera documentary. $1 million from the DoorDash family owner. The story of Zohran Mamdani's victory is truly a story of David versus Goliath. So the story of David versus Goliath is in the Bible. It's also in the Quran. It's really the story of someone going from rags to riches, from obscurity to success, from poverty to prosperity, not literally, but figuratively. In short, Zohran Mamdani's victory is about someone going from zero name recognition to hero in less than 1 year. And the question is, how did he do it? So let me quote from Bernie Sanders, because just when I was leaving the United States to come to Malaysia, I was just watching the television, and Zohran Mamdani and Bernie Sanders are together in New York City outside of Starbucks, supporting protesting Starbucks workers who are fighting for better wages and working conditions. And they both gave speeches, and in the speech, Bernie Sanders gets up and he says the following about Zohran Mamdani. And he said, quote, Zohran Mamdani ran one of the great campaigns in the modern history of this country. He started off at 1% and he won. How did he win? He won because he put together tens and tens of thousands of volunteers who knocked on doors. He won because he had the guts to talk about the oligarchs and saying that when he becomes mayor, he's going to stand with the workers here at Starbucks and the workers all over this city. And then Sanders went on to say, and what we are seeing in America right now, in congressional races, in the Senate races, you are seeing more and more candidates standing up exactly in the same way that Zohran Mamdani did. And they are standing up and saying that we need an economy that works for everybody. We're not going to let the billionaires get tax breaks while people are losing their health insurance. We're going to raise the minimum wage to a living wage rather than a starvation wage. We're not going to be the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care as a human right. And so you're going to see that politics are changing in America, Bernie Sanders concluded. It's evolving, and I think this is a good thing. And he says, what we have is we have the grassroots of America behind us. What Mamdani did is inspire people all over this country and all over the world, and we're going to keep going forward in this direction. And I thought that was a nice summary of why Mamdani ran. And so to understand how he ran and to understand his political platform, I think it's safe to say that Zohran Mamdani's political philosophy is a direct byproduct, it's a derivative of Bernie Sanders' political platform. In terms of substance, in terms of orientation, with only minor differences. In other words, it's a left-wing populist agenda rooted in a moral center and with a democratic core. Now, who is Mamdani? What do we know about his background? We know that he was born in Uganda and he came to the United States at the age of 8 years old. His parents are the acclaimed filmmaker Mira Nair, who's a Hindu, a secular Hindu, very distinguished in her field, and Columbia University professor anthropologist Mahmoud Mamdani. He's an African studies scholar, a scholar of colonialism and post-colonialism, and he's also a Muslim who's ethnically Gujarati. His family came from India, they came to Uganda, they migrated. So on his father's side, his family are Khoja Muslims. and they're Shia Muslims of the Ithna Ashari, the Twelver school. And it was interesting that this issue of Zohran Mamdani's father's background being Shia became at one moment part of the New York election campaign. Because I was watching this, and I never thought I'd see this in New York politics, when the polls showed that Mamdani was taking a lead and Cuomo was struggling. All of a sudden, Cuomo, the opponent, says Zohran Mamdani is creating divisions within the Muslim community. He's a Shia. The Muslim community here is Sunni. He's creating fitna. And I'm saying, oh my God, who would have thought that sectarianism was being invoked in the context of New York politics? And of course, Mamdani never claimed publicly, at least, to claim that he was a Shia. He just said, I'm a Muslim. But somebody whispered in Cuomo's ear that the way to sort of get the Muslim community to create divisions and to not support Mamdani is to try and scare them. And unfortunately, we see that in many other parts of the Muslim world. Unfortunately, I'm told also here in Malaysia, they have these scare tactics. It happened in New York. It didn't work at all, but it was interesting to see that Cuomo was playing that game. I'll say more about his father and his Muslim background in a moment. In terms of Mamdani, he grew up in New York City. He went to a prestigious high school. He couldn't get into Columbia University, where his father teaches, because it's a very prestigious school. So he ends up going to a respectable liberal arts college in Maine called Bowdoin College, which is a small liberal arts school. While there, he majors in African studies and political science. And while he's there as a student, he's the founder of a Palestine solidarity group. So he starts the Students for Justice in Palestine on campus. And if you read the political reporting on Mamdani, it's very clear the question of Palestine is central to his political identity. And this comes up in the campaign, as I'll say in a moment. So this is what he does when he's an undergraduate student there. After he graduates, he goes to New York City and he works as a housing counselor for a nonprofit organization in New York City focusing on South Asian immigrant communities. He pursues a musical career as a rapper. He doesn't get anywhere. And then he gets involved in supporting local political campaigns. And then he decides to run for political office. And in the year 2020, about 5 years ago, he becomes elected. He wins a seat in the New York Assembly, based in Albany, New York, the capital of New York, representing the area of Astoria, Queens. And that's when he starts to have a little bit of name recognition. But still, unless you lived in New York City, you wouldn't know who Mamdani is. So Mamdani first becomes a national figure in 2021 when he appears on the news program Democracy Now! Because he's taking part in a 15-day hunger strike to demand debt relief for protesting New York taxi drivers. And this is his first national exposure. And this gives you insight into his political agenda. He has a political agenda that's rooted in democratic politics, socialist politics, similar to Bernie Sanders, but more on a local level, focusing on the immediate needs of people living in a big urban center. He doesn't speak about national issues. He focuses on New York politics. And then he announces that he's going to run for the mayor of New York City, focusing on the theme of affordability. This is central to Zohran Mamdani, the theme of affordability. And his argument was New York City is just too expensive for too many people to live in, and he wants to change that. And if you look at the statistics, 25% of New Yorkers live in poverty. And so he says, I'm going to focus on this theme of affordability, specifically on the following items that he wants to implement if he gets elected. He says, if you elect me, I'm going to have a rent freeze. I'm going to freeze the rent. Because rents every year keep going up. People can't live. Their wages aren't enough. Rent freeze, free buses, childcare for families with young children, and he wants to establish one government-run food store or grocery store in the 5 different areas of New York City. And he's going to appeal to the working class, segment of New York, but also the young people who have moved to New York. They've graduated from university. They're trying to make a living. That's the people he's concerned about. He's not interested in the corporate ruling class, the business class, the upper class. He says he wants to use the instruments of government to help this group of people have a better life. He doesn't appeal to the landlords. He appeals to the tenants, to the workers, to the immigrants who are struggling to make their lives and pay their bills in New York City. And he says that, look, the way I'm going to pay for this is that the rich in this city, there's a lot of rich people in New York, they're going to have to pay a little bit more taxes so that many people can benefit. So what was his strategy? How did he manage to win? Because nobody knew who he was. He didn't have a lot of financial backing. One thing that he did was he had a very effective use of social media, of short-term videos, of digital videos that spoke specifically to the younger generation and to those people who normally didn't get involved in politics, the disengaged voters. He appealed to, this younger group of people, the Gen Z, people in their 20s and in their 30s. And he was able to do something that, because he reached this group of people, the voter participation rate in New York City rose to historically high levels. But I think the core aspect of watching this campaign, what really explains his success, was the real hard work that he put in to win this campaign. And this has been underrated. What do I mean by the hard work? I'm talking about the physical exertion of energy through the campaign. He was able to mobilize 100,000 people in New York City. And according to one report, they knocked on the doors of 1 million people, volunteers. Some of the people that I knew would, on the weekends and the evenings, just go and knock on doors. In New York City, that's actually a dangerous thing to do because people are scared. Someone's knocking on my door. I'm not going to open it. So this is sort of, just think, he had 100,000 people. The former governor of New York, didn't do any of this. He just had a sense of entitlement. He would just show up. He thought his name recognition would win. It would be an easy time. But the amount of energy and time that the Mamdani campaign demonstrated showed that they were really serious about winning. And he did things like, he did these daring things to raise his profile. So he decided to walk across the entire New York City. From early morning, he walked and he just would meet people as he was going on, and the media would follow him. So he would arrive at somebody's home or in some district unannounced and just start shaking hands. He would go to churches, to mosques, to synagogues, to restaurants, to community centers. He would show up unannounced. He would do creative things. Like, one of the things that he did is he organized a scavenger hunt in New York City to bring people out. In short, he worked really hard by pounding the pavement, meeting people anywhere and everywhere they lived, and he started to speak to them about his agenda of affordability. Right? So he showed that he really wanted to win by virtue of the hard work that he put in. The other reason why he won is that he had a lot of really good advisors around him. All of these advisors were young people. They were roughly in their 20s and in their 30s. They were talented. They were idealistic. They were incorruptible, and they came from different segments of New York City. Many of them were young Jews attracted by his campaign. Zohran Mamdani was a member of the Democratic Socialist Association. This group was the network of organizers and field commanders who would mobilize people to go throughout the city. He had them as a backbone. But there was much more to Mamdani than simply this. Other organizations were created and formed to help Mamdani, and many of them were rooted in the Muslim community in New York City and in the South Asian community in New York City. You had groups that were formed such as Desi's Rising Up and Moving, known as by the acronym DRUM. There was an organization called the Muslim Democratic Club of New York, Bangladeshi Americans for Political Progress, grassroots NGO organizations like Pakistanis for Zohran and Bangladeshis for Zohran. The mobilization of these communities, South Asian communities, Muslim communities, had never been done before. If you look at the numbers, there's roughly between 800,000 to 1 million Muslims in New York City. If you look at the figures, of people who live here, of people who are registered voters from that community, about 350 to 400,000 Muslims were registered to vote, but only 12% of them voted in the last election. By reaching out to this constituency, Mamdani was able to take the South Asian and the Muslim community, encourage them to vote, and that increased his support line to a very high level. And that was something unique that he did by spending a lot of time talking to South Asian communities and to Muslim communities, realizing that this was a potential group of people that would vote for him if he could just reach them. So yes, there was massive Muslim turnout in New York City. In New York City, the third largest religious group in New York City, after Jews, then Catholics, are Muslims. So this was one key to his success. Now, one of the interesting things about the Mamdani campaign is how the question of Palestine and Gaza became part of the campaign. And it's interesting, it became part of the campaign not because Mamdani introduced it, because you could ask yourself, look, I'm running for mayor of New York, I'm not running for president of the United States. So why does international affairs come up? So what happened was that his opponents thought that they could bring in the question of Israel-Palestine, force him to speak about it, and that he would make mistakes and he would lose support. What happened was the exact opposite. Because Mamdani adopted a principled position on the basic human rights of the Palestinians, that helped him increase his support among his base supporters, because many young people in the United States views the genocide in Gaza as a moral litmus test. And if somebody stands up and speaks honestly and accurately and with courage on the question of Gaza, their popularity goes up because it demonstrates they have moral integrity. And it provides a contrast with how most politicians either don't talk about Gaza, or if they do talk about Gaza in the United States, they talk about it from a pro-Israel perspective. Mamdani, every time this subject came up, he would talk about it, and he even went on to say that if he gets elected mayor and Benjamin Netanyahu comes to New York City, I will arrest him as a war criminal, because the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant, and that's international law, and international law applies in the New York City that he will govern as mayor. And people said, oh my God, what politician in the United States says that in New York City? And so people who were following the question of Gaza and knew what was going on thought that was an act of courage. It also helped him that his opponent had taken a position on Benjamin Netanyahu and volunteered to become part of Benjamin Netanyahu's legal defense team. So the contrast between an ethical position on Gaza and a morally indefensible position on Gaza was like night and day between Mamdani and his adversary, Andrew Cuomo. Then there was this one moment in the campaign where there was a television debate, and all of the candidates who were running for office were answering questions from the media. And then, because this is New York City, the question that often gets asked is, if you become mayor of New York City, what's the first country you're going to go to? And most of the candidates, thinking that, look, there's a powerful pro-Israel community here, they all gave the same answer. Not all of them, but majority. They all said, I'm going to Israel. First country that you're going to go to, I'm going to Israel. Then it comes to Mamdani. Where are you going to go? He says, I'm not going anywhere. I'm elected mayor of New York. I'm going to stay here and serve the citizens of New York. Oh my God, how can you say that in New York City? And then they kept pressing him. Do you recognize Israel as a Jewish state? And he goes, no, I don't recognize Israel as a Jewish state. I recognize Israel as a state under the UN system, but I recognize Israel as a state for equal citizens for everybody, not as an ethnically supremacist state. This was a position that was considered to be courageous and was considered to be very risky, because you don't say that in the United States. If you speak about the question of Israel-Palestine in the United States, you either say nothing, or if you say anything, you express a pro-Israel position. Mamdani took that norm or that rule, flipped it on its head, and won support from young people, including from many young American Jews who were inspired by his honesty and who, drawing upon their own Jewish religious ethical tradition, said that we cannot defend what Israel is doing in the name of Judaism or in the name of the Jewish people. And they looked to Mamdani as a voice of courage, of character, and of conscience. But Mamdani also went beyond sort of I think his appeal was much more than the question of affordability. When he spoke like this on the question of Gaza, it raised his, I think, image in the eyes of many people that this is a young man that has authenticity, that he's a real person who's reflecting how many people in the United States feel, but they don't have the courage to speak out. And so I think, ironically, his opponents thought that they could box him in on the question of Israel-Palestine. He turned it around, and actually it helped him get elected in ways that now we're seeing in the United States. Many politicians now are publicly coming forward and saying, we're not going to take any more pro-Israel donor money, because what Israel has done has been so horrific and so shocking that support for Israel now, in the minds of many people, is just bad politics. You're going to lose votes now. It's an embarrassment. So you have people doing things that I never thought I'd ever see, saying, look, we're not going to take any private money from pro-Israel organizations. Mamdani sort of is the one who I think established that trend in American politics. And we'll have to see how far it goes. The other thing about Mamdani's campaign that stood out to me, and I mentioned it a moment ago, but it's worth mentioning, is the level of Islamophobia that I saw was unprecedented. And it was coming not just from obscure figures on the social media. It was coming from powerful politicians in the United States. Members of Congress were sending out the most toxic, the most incendiary, the most defamatory descriptions of Mamdani that reminded me of the sort of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda that one saw during World War II, including his opponent, Andrew Cuomo. So there's one moment where Andrew Cuomo is on a radio program, and then he's asked about Mamdani and what happens if he gets elected, and he agrees with his interviewer, who said that if Mamdani gets elected, there could be another 9/11 attack on New York City. And they're joking and mocking, and this is the type of campaign. The good news is that despite all of this anti-Muslim Islamophobic propaganda, it didn't make a difference in the end in terms of the final result. And this forced Mamdani at one key point, because the level of attacks and the fear-mongering was so great, he had to make a decision. Does he address this issue of Islamophobia and speak to it, or does he ignore it? And I can imagine there was an internal discussion among his advisors saying, look, don't say anything about this because it's going to make it worse for you. Just ignore it. But he had to make a decision, and interesting, he made a decision where he gave a very famous speech on Islamophobia on Friday prayer, where he comes outside of a mosque and he stands in front of the cameras, and behind him are people from the mosque. It was very carefully choreographed, and he gives a very famous speech where he owns his Muslim identity. He pushes back on these attempts to attack him and other Muslims, and he takes a firm stand against bigotry, against racism, and against Islamophobia. It's considered to be one of the most important speeches in American history that's been compared to the famous speech that Obama gave in 2008 on race. It was a very famous, sort of courageous speech that was a risky speech because it could have worked against him. In the end, it did make a difference, and I think in many quarters it helped him. But he kept bringing the issue back to the theme of affordability. The question of Palestine, the question of Islamophobia were attempts to distract Mamdani. He would address those issues when it came up, but he kept bringing his campaign back to the question of affordability. He didn't allow his critics to distract him. And I think that's fundamentally why he won in the end. So now let's transition to the whole question of what can Malaysians learn from this particular story. I think the problems that fueled Mamdani's rise to power, questions of affordability, questions of poverty, questions of wealth and income inequality, these are global issues that everyone is struggling with. The problem of oligarchy, the problem that there's a ruling class who own most of the wealth, these are problems that have universal appeal now, and they produce authoritarian politics. There's a Nobel Prize laureate who's written a lot on this issue, a man by the name of Joseph Stiglitz, who has said that we now are facing a global inequality emergency. And the facts bear this out. We have statistics now published by reliable NGOs that suggest and state that the sixth richest people in the world, own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50%. Just think about that. And in the United States, we have a similar statistic. The three richest men in the United States, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, own more wealth than the bottom half of the United States. 165 million people. So just think about that. Three people have more wealth than 165 million people, and the wealth of these three people is increasing. So this sort of speaks to, I think, the agenda that Zohran Mamdani is very much trying to address. And it raises the question, what can we learn from this campaign of affordability and of income inequality and its relationship to authoritarianism? And I think one of the takeaways from this campaign is a realization that even when it seems like authoritarian politics are dominant, even when it seems like these wealthy oligarchs are all-powerful, that they dominate the political system, they're getting wealthier, and everyone else is getting poorer. When it seems like all hope is gone, what Mamdani represents is a vision that you can still fight for democratic politics, challenge the rule of oligarchs, and actually win if you pursue the right strategy and if you focus on the right topics. And so in the case of Mamdani, the takeaway is, what we learn from Mamdani is that if you focus on basic questions of affordability, of economic class, and you de-emphasize, you don't ignore, but you de-emphasize the themes of ethnic and racial identity politics, you speak to people's basic material needs, you can get a hearing. You can mobilize people. You can inspire people to come out and to give up on their apathy or their sense of disillusionment. And if you speak to people at the grassroots level and talk to them about their basic needs and listen to them in their own communities, and if you organically connect to them, you can get a positive reception and you can mobilize people to re-engage with politics and you can defeat these powerful political forces. I think these are some of the ingredients of the success that I've seen in the Mamdani campaign and that arguably apply to other societies around the world, perhaps even in Malaysia. Let me just end by talking about the Islamic ethics and his Muslim background. So when Mamdani started to run for office, I was very much intrigued because I study Muslim politics and I'm a Muslim. I was intrigued by his Muslim background. I wasn't aware that he had any Islamic consciousness or identity. Obviously, I knew his background was Muslim, but I didn't think, Islam was any part of his political identity because, number one, his parents. His parents were considered to be very secular, political, and intellectual leaders. His mother is a secular Hindu filmmaker. His father is a scholar of Africa and had a reputation as being a secular Muslim. But then when I looked into it and I started to read, I understood how deeply wrong I was. Zohran Mamdani does take his religion very seriously. He self-identifies as a Muslim. He's motivated by an Islamic ethical core that informs his politics and informs the theme of affordability, which is foundational to his campaign. It informs his sense of understanding of the question of Palestine and other political positions as well. And so from reading all of these scattered reports about Zohran Mamdani's Muslim and Islamic identity, what I've learned and what I've gathered is, number one, he proudly and publicly asserts his identity as a Muslim, as a practicing Muslim. He fasts, he prays, he goes to the mosque. One indication is that right after he got elected, he went to Puerto Rico for a conference. And there's a video you can see online where he goes to the mosque in Puerto Rico. He prays Jummah prayer. He stands up and gives a speech. After Jummah prayer, he's giving out food to people. He gives a little talk about what it means to be a Muslim. There's a lot of stories in his campaign that were actually quite moving, where when he was running for political office, there was an event that happened where a Bangladeshi police officer was shot by a gunman in New York. And at this time, Mamdani was in Uganda because he just got married and he was visiting his family. He immediately flies back to New York City and he goes to the Bangladeshi family and he visits and consoles them. Then there's a memorial service in the mosque, and reporters who are chronicling this saying all these rich dignitaries are there at the mosque. Mamdani doesn't sit with them. He sits on the floor with the family and he prays with them and he grieves with them and he keeps going back and consoling the family, doing what you're supposed to do as a Muslim when someone has lost a family member. There's a very famous story that has come up that gives you a sense that his father actually did have a Muslim background and identity. And this has been reported several times. So his father was a student in the United States in the 1960s. And there's a story that when he was a student in the United States, he just gets on a bus where a lot of other students were going to the southern part of the United States to fight for civil rights in Alabama and Mississippi during the struggle for civil rights, the era of Martin Luther King. And there's a story that the bus is leaving New York City and it's traveling down south. And then the bus driver pulls over the bus and he turns to the people in the bus and says, "There's somebody on the bus who wants me to pull over because he says he has to pray. Does everyone in the bus agree that we should pull over for 10 minutes and allow this person to pray?" And they take a vote and everyone says yes. And so the bus stops, people go out and of the bus, and this guy by the name of Mahmoud Mamdani gets out to pray, and all of the people in the bus surround him to protect him so he can say his prayers, and then everyone gets back on the bus. So there is this sort of story where his father at one point was a practicing Muslim. I know from colleagues that in 1995, the Mamdani family goes to South Africa because Mahmoud Mamdani is there on sabbatical. And Zohran Mamdani gets his early Islamic education by going to a mosque, the Claremont Mosque, that was affiliated with the struggle against apartheid, supporting Nelson Mandela. And Mamdani goes to Islamic school at that time. When he's in South Africa, his grandparents from his father's side come to South Africa and spend time with the family. And we now have reports that the basic Islamic education that Zohran Mamdani got was from his grandparents on his father's side, who taught him the basic rituals and surahs that introduced this young boy, Zohran Mamdani, to Islam. When Zohran Mamdani was a college student, I'm pretty sure he met other Muslim students at his college. He probably went to iftar. He probably prayed. He was very active in Palestine solidarity circles where there were many Muslim students. There's an interesting story that when Mamdani is in college, he goes to Egypt to study Arabic. And when he goes to Egypt to study Arabic, it's in the summer of 2013. And if you know what was happening in Egypt in the summer of 2013, this is at the height of the Arab Spring Revolution, when the coup d'etat takes place and Mohamed Morsi is captured and General Assisi comes to power. And when Mamdani was in Egypt at the time, he grows a beard. And all of his Egyptian friends are joking to him and say, you got to be careful, Zohran. Everyone's going to think you're a Muslim Brotherhood supporter because you look like one of these people. And so Mamdani is there during the time of this coup d'etat and this shock moment when there's a massacre and the military comes to power. And I'm sure it must have affected his identity as a Muslim. He learns some Arabic there. And then, you start to see these things in the context of his campaign. There was a very famous New York Times article that talked about, it was called Why Zohran Mamdani is Not Shy About His Religion. And the article basically says that Zohran Mamdani is doing something that no other mayor in New York has done in a very long time. He uses the language of religion to appeal to working class voters. And he's very comfortable going to a mosque, going to a Hindu temple, going to a synagogue, and talking to people in religious language because he is someone who takes religion seriously. And this is something that's shocking because most mayors of New York don't take religion seriously. And so there's these, stories that you read where he's very happy talking to Bangladeshi and Pakistani uncles and aunties. And when I was preparing this for this visit to Malaysia, I was doing some research, and there's a very nice video where it shows Zohran Mamdani is in a Bangladeshi restaurant in New York City. And this is after the election. And he gives a short speech to the Bangladeshi Muslims where he says, and I'm quoting him, he says, "What we did in this primary election is we increased the turnout of Muslims by 60% and the turnout of South Asians by 40%. And then he goes on to say to this group of Muslims, he goes, "And when I stood in front of the world and gave a speech last night after the election victory, I made sure to remember the Bangladeshi aunties who knocked on the doors across this city. And people have asked me, what will it mean to have a Muslim mayor in New York City?" And Mamdani responds by saying, "It means what my grandmother Kulsum taught me, that to be a good Muslim is to be a good person. It is to help those in need and to harm no one. That's what it means to be a Muslim in New York City." And I think this is an interesting takeaway, because I think if you look at Mamdani's Islamic ethics and you look at this theme of affordability, it overlaps with these core themes of Islamic social justice. We have as one of the pillars in Islam the concept of zakat, the concept of you not allowed to hoard wealth. You have to distribute it. It's your moral obligation. That's very much the theme of affordability. We also have this Islamic traditional concept and behavior of the Awqaf tradition, of endowments, where if you're a rich person, you have the obligation to use your wealth to set up these religious endowments to help people in society, whether it's for educational purposes or for meeting the basic needs. So these are the themes. So the theme of affordability is very much, I think, a derivative of Zohran Mamdani's Islamic ethical approach. And one reason why I think many Muslims haven't made this connection between the theme of affordability and Mamdani's Islamic ethics is because, unfortunately, in our Muslim communities, we don't give serious thought to the question of Islamic ethics and socio and economic justice. One of the great Islamic scholars who Farouk knows, and I've talked about here in Malaysia, Khalid Abu Fadl, has made a comment on this topic that says that, look, do we raise our children today, he asks, with the principle of takaful, the principle of the moral collective responsibility that Muslims have to our communities? Do we raise societies in the Muslim world with the knowledge of the fact that in Islamic morality, you cannot fill your stomach up with food when you know that your brother and sister is hungry? Do we raise our children to think about the idea of safety and enjoying life, that you can't enjoy life as a Muslim when you know your brothers and sisters are suffering? Do our Islamic schools teach these concepts of Islamic ethics, that this is foundational? When we think about and we teach the seerah, the biography of the Prophet, do we talk about these Islamic norms? Professor Khalid Abu al-Fadl asked. And of course the answer is no. And this is why I think many Muslims have struggled to see the Islamic ethics in Mamdani's campaign. But in many ways, properly understood, I think what Mamdani has demonstrated in his political campaign and in his emphasis on socioeconomic justice and on democracy and on the theme of affordability is very much a reflection of the best tradition of Islamic ethics. And so I think what Mamdani is indirectly saying is, being a Muslim today is not about obsessing over the hijab or obsessing over what sect you belong to. It's about socio and economic justice. And so one of the takeaways that I think for Malaysians that we can get from this campaign and this young man is Mamdani challenges us as Muslims to think about Islamic ethics in relationship to basic questions of socioeconomic inequality. I think that's one of the big takeaways. So in summary, I want to admit that when we think about what lessons Malaysians can learn from Zohran Mamdani, we have to be, I think, somewhat careful to assume that New York politics is Kuala Lumpur politics, or American politics is Malaysian politics. But I think there is something to be learned about how you can challenge entrenched political groups by focusing on people's basic socioeconomic needs, by launching a grassroots campaign where you go into communities, you talk to people, you listen to people, and you speak ethically and honestly. One of the things about the Mamdani campaign that strikes me is people are inspired, people are motivated, people are willing to support someone who demonstrates honesty, who demonstrates courage, and who demonstrates an ethical approach to politics. So the key themes of the Mamdani campaign that I think have universal application, perhaps even in Malaysia, but you're going to have to tell me, is the theme of focusing on the real material needs of people so that they don't sink into poverty, to be authentic and honest, to be courageous, to speak truth to power, to don't compromise with powerful political forces, that you can win political contests by out-organizing your opponent, even though if you don't have the same amount of wealth, and focusing on the Islamic ethics of Zohran Mamdani that I've just talked about. So let me just end with one of my my favorite surahs of the Quran. It's one of the shortest surahs, but in many ways this surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Asr, encapsulates and embodies the entire, I think, core message of the Quran, which is one reason why I like it. And of course, it's Surah Al-Asr that everyone knows. You know, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal asr, innal insana lafi khus, illa alladhina amanu wa amadu salahat, wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr, which translates as, you know, consider, you know, the passage of time. You know, God says humanity will certainly be lost, misguided, except for those who have faith and do good deeds and encourage people to pursue the truth and have patience. And the theme of that surah, do good deeds, amalus salahat, is very much, I think, what Mamdani has been demonstrating. What are good deeds? Speaking to people's basic socioeconomic needs, speaking to people's sense of vulnerability. These are many of the good deeds that I think, you know, are very much part of the Islamic ethical tradition. And one of the challenges is for us to try and think more deeply about how, you know, Mamdani's political campaign does force many Muslims to think about what are Islamic ethics in the age of 2025 in a big urban city like New York City. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nader, Prof. Nader. So, I think we have a good number of audience over here.
Yeah.
Before we open to the floor, I'd just like to comment that, you know, basically it was a very good speech on Zohran Mamdani, and I think you listed a few important points that probably not many of us over here are aware of. Especially on his work. Was basically a continuation of the work of Bernie Sanders. Right. But, you know, like, of course I have a question, which I'll leave later. I'll let them ask first. But the thing is that I also like to, I was so impressed that, you know, when you were giving the meaning of the Surah Al-Asr, the verse, you said they will ask, consider the passage of time. That was basically for Muhammad Assad. Because only Muhammad Assad used the word consider the passage of time.
That's where probably I have it from in my mind.
Oh, really?
I'm thinking, because I use his translation of the Quran.
Right. Because Jakim would not agree to that. Jakim would say that the waw in the wal asr is waw qasam. Means that it's it is like that God swears in the name of this time, rather than consider the passage of time. So which is very important, because I agree with them on this aspect as well.
So just out of curiosity, how does these Malaysian religious authorities, how do they interpret the first few words of Surah Al-Asr? They don't think that God is talking about consider the passage of time.
No. The thing is that because in Jews, the final chapter
Yeah.
of the Quran, many verses, many of
Yeah.
the Quranic
Yeah.
chapters
Yeah.
will start with the Wasama Izati
Right.
Buruj, for
Right.
example,
Yeah.
and consider the
Yeah.
the sky
Yeah.
and the constellations
Yeah.
and the constellation of stars. So the thing is that they want the wow there
Yeah.
to be wow qasam.
Yeah.
They don't want it to be like
Yeah.
to use
Yeah.
our intellect to
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
to ponder.
Yeah.
They don't
Well,
want that.
my response to that is that's fine. If that's their interpretation, all of us are, none of us can claim to be, to have the final word, right?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things that unfortunately many Muslims forget
Yeah.
today, is that all of us are simply trying to, as human beings, none of us are perfect, right? All of us are flawed. We all try our best to interpret God's will within the limits of our own faculties.
Exactly.
No one can say that their interpretation is the final interpretation. Muhammad Asad, for example, was a great scholar. And so he interprets that particular verse in one particular way. And it's up to Muslims to decide which interpretation they find most compelling. And the problem becomes is when one group of Muslims says,
Yeah.
look, this is the only way
Yeah.
that you should understand your religion. And if you don't, then somehow you are a flawed Muslim or you are not a real Muslim. Then we get into these big problems.
Yeah, I also like to emphasize the fact that you mentioned about the idea of Zohran Mamdani as
Yeah.
basically a socialist democracy.
Yeah,
And I always believe,
Yeah.
like, because that I'm doing my
Islam,
current
yeah,
PhD
PhD.
in Islamic
Yeah,
Studies, and it's on Assad.
yeah,
And after reading the translation of Assad,
yeah,
then I somehow observe
yeah,
that the actual fact is that in Islam, it is more skewed to the left. It is more skewed to
Yeah.
the left.
yeah,
And like everything talks about social justice.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah. It's an enduring theme. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But this thing has been, neglected
Yeah.
among the Muslims nowadays.
It's a big problem. I agree, and I think that's why that quote that I read from Khalid Abu Fadl when he talks about Islamic ethics, he asks these questions: do we teach our children in our schools, in our programming, that look, part of what it means to be a Muslim is you can't be a Muslim in any meaningful sense of that term when you are eating food knowing that your neighbor is going hungry,
Right.
or knowing that there is pain and suffering in the world and you're not doing something about it. Now, we don't even think in these terms because unfortunately the way we're taught Islam is all that matters is the outward appearance. How long your beard is, how encompassing your hijab is, whether you're from the right madhab. And I think what Mamdani is sort of teaching us, not maybe consciously, this is what my interpretation of, is very much related to what Khalid Abu Fadl is saying, that when there's suffering in society, then, you can't ignore that if you claim to be a Muslim. You have to be engaged. You have to be trying to solve these problems. And so in many ways, the Mamdani campaign of affordability is recognizing that in society, in New York City, 25% of the people there are living in poverty.
Yeah.
People can't pay their rent. People can't buy food. People can't get on a bus. So as a Muslim, you have to respond to those to this problem. And to simply think that, being a Muslim is to simply do your, salah on time, and you fast in Ramadan, and you go to Hajj if you can, and that's all that means. But you're not engaging in the day-to-day struggle and suffering and pain that people are feeling on a daily basis. That understanding of Islamic ethics, I think, is unfortunately not more widely recognized among Muslims. I think the passage that I read from Khalid Abu Fadl, the questions, is very much, I think, much more solidly Islamic and ethical. And I think Mamdani, I'd love to interview him on these issues, because every time he talks about Islam, you can tell that he has deep knowledge of it, and it's very much part of his worldview. But no one has really sort of, had the type of conversation that I would like to have on him to draw out his, where he gets these ideas from, To what extent is this concept of, affordability connected to his own understanding of Islamic ethics? I'm pretty sure, he would say that there is a connection. But this is sort of, I think, one of the lessons that we can learn from Mamdani is how do we reimagine and rethink what it means to be an ethical Muslim human being in a world where there's so much suffering. And I think what Mamdani teaches us is that you have to be engaged in alleviating that suffering. To ignore it and think that it doesn't matter, it doesn't affect me, is to sort of undermine one of the core tenets of Islam, and that's the theme of justice. Socioeconomic justice, inequality, poverty. Exactly. And of course, this is a global problem because as I said when I cited the statistics, 6 people in this world own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of humanity. How is that fair? How is that going to, and this is going to create huge problems. It's going to create anger, it's going to create resentment, it's going to create, authoritarian politics. And this is very much not just sort of something what does the concept of zakat teach us? Like, why is zakat one of the pillars of being a Muslim? Because it's rooted in this Islamic notion that hoarding wealth, concentrated power, is unjust. It creates the type of problems that we're seeing in our world today. You have a Muslim moral obligation to take your wealth and to spread it around. And if you don't, then you are violating what it means to be a Muslim. And then you have the whole Awqaf tradition of religious endowments. If you have a lot of money, you should set up these endowments and use that wealth to solve the problems of society or promote good things in society. These things are often, I think, not connected to politics, to political platforms. I think why many people in the United States, like myself, who come from a Muslim background, respond to a Bernie Sanders agenda is because it's deeply informed by a commitment to justice, a commitment to equality, a commitment to everyone should be treated equally, should have a dignified life. Bernie Sanders and Mamdani on the question of the big injustice in our world today, the question of Gaza and genocide, have spoken out loudly and clearly, and this inspires people. And so I think those are the lessons that we can learn.
All right. Thank you.